Thank you. Thank you for your questions. You last week sent in thoughtful questions about God and faith and purpose, and that is the basis for our podcast on Thursdays, the Pastor's Pregame podcast, to answer your questions. We want to interact together. And so throughout the service or on social media, text in your questions to the number that's on your screen. Otherwise, what are we going to talk about on the podcast? We need your questions so we can interact with them, because that's the plan. We want to keep the conversation going. So send them in. A few years ago, my wife, Tamara, graciously opened our home to my racquetball friends and a few others to engage in a series of conversations about these 7 questions. We pretty much knew each other in gym shorts and protective eyewear as we chased a little blue ball around the court in mostly friendly competition. Though it was fascinating to hear their honest reflections and perspectives on God and faith and the perspectives of their significant others in our home on those evenings. Probably not surprising to you, the perspectives ranged widely, from the thought that maybe God is sort of the force that connects all of us to, there's not really a God. One gentleman said quite clearly, hey, makes people feel better to believe there's a God, especially on their deathbed. It's simply not true. As we got to know each other better in the course of the weeks, we came to realize that a lot of our thoughts about God rested not so much on intellectual analysis as they did on life experiences. One of my lesbian friends told us the story of how she had felt Christians verbally attack her. And she had served in a clinic for men with HIV back in the 80s, before there was a lot of the medicines we have today. And some of them came from Christian homes, and their parents wouldn't talk to them. And she went to their funerals. All of them. They all died. That scarred her soul. Another friend showed me a newspaper clipping, said, this will help you understand my story. It was a story in the newspaper of he and his brother having been abused by a priest in Louisiana. When you have experiences like that, and others that my friend shared of hurt or religious hurt in some religious institution or other, people who'd let them down, you can see why people say, I'm going to have nothing to do with religion. And I'm not sure there's a God anyway. Experiences of disappointment, when you prayed as hard as you could pray, and your baby died, your child didn't survive. It's not surprising that you say, I won't pray again, because there can't be a good God. If you've lived long enough, you've been through some tough crises. The longer you live, the more you go through. And in some of those difficult crises, sometimes you run to God, sometimes you wonder if there is a God. I think most everybody at some time in your life has asked that question. You may be asking it right now, or maybe wondering that. Is there even a God at all? Maybe there is, maybe there's not, I don't know. To ask the question honestly, frankly, takes a lot of courage. If you're going to reconsider what you believe about a question that has that much gravity to it, that's not going to be easy. You got to open your mind to consider new evidence, new ideas, to rethink it. And what you shouldn't do is take some blind leap of faith. Does it take faith to believe in God? Well, okay, sure. But really what you're talking about there is confidence in God. Like you can believe that a person exists. That's different than trusting that person. So we're going to talk about the fact that God exists, or the claim of God's existence, not whether you should trust him or not. That's another question. So we'll get there. And I find that a lot of people expect too much certainty here. And we talked about how do you know if God exists or not, and how certain can you be? How confident can you be? Most humans, probably you do, I do, crave certainty. But we're finite people. We're finite creatures. We can't know most anything with certainty, including whether God exists or not. We can't be certain about most anything in our lives. You don't know if you're gonna have a job next year, if you're gonna even stay married, if you're gonna wake up tomorrow. We don't know when the end of our life's gonna come. And yet we crave certainty. And that makes sense, I get that. So about God, the question is more about reasonableness than certainty. What's most reasonable to believe, that God exists or not? For my wife, Tamara, and I, we faced a decision a few years ago about our old Ford Focus wagon. Had over 200,000 miles. Do we trade it in or do we keep it a little longer? And we were trying to save enough money to buy the new car, but we were a long way from saving up enough money. So do we keep it a little longer or do we trade it in? You can never know with absolute certainty, but we could make an informed decision. So a retired car expert guy took the car and he went over it bumper to bumper. Like he literally got his camera and took close-up pictures, a lot of pictures. Sent all of them to me. Anyway, then he scoured all kind of websites about cars and studied our model, and he sent me literally he's an engineer, multi-page report in detail. And his conclusion was, you should trade it in right now. We talked to our Ford dealer, they go, yeah, that's what you should do. Were we absolutely certain that was the right decision? No. No one knows how long the car could have lasted. It could have gone another 100,000 miles. But we chose to trade it in. It was an informed, reasonable decision. Now, I share that to, again, think about God. Now, the decision about God's existence obviously has a lot more gravity than buying a new car. But it's the issue about how much confidence do we have? How much certainty do we expect in a decision like this? I think the illustration or the example of trial by jury helps here. In the United States, if you're going to serve on a jury, they're asking you, can you decide guilty or innocence beyond a reasonable doubt? We know, not, are you absolutely certain? You need to be absolutely certain if they're guilty or innocent. We would never make decisions in our juries. We don't have absolute certainty. And so, can you believe, or is it more reasonable to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that God exists or he does not exist? Not that all your doubts are going to go away. That's not going to be the case. Or you believe with absolute certainty. What's more reasonable? But perhaps you want to take a third position. Well, what could that be? Some people choose the position, or they claim the position of essentially permanent agnosticism. You may believe, you may say, I am sure we cannot be sure. You cannot know if God exists or not. Now, did you hear yourself? Play that back in your mind. You're certain we can't be certain, or sure we can't be sure. Okay, that's a position. On what basis do you hold that? What's your evidence that would make that reasonable to believe? In other words, it's not sufficient, it's not intellectually honest to simply assert, well, you can't be sure whether God exists or not. Okay, that's a position, but just claiming it is like I'm going to take a blind leap in the faith and say God exists with no evidence. What's your rationale? What's your evidence to assert that it's most reasonable that we can permanently be unsure God exists? Is that more reasonable than to believe he exists or doesn't exist? here's what I want to do. In our conversation, I want us to think through, consider 4 lines of evidence for God's existence. I want you to imagine with me walking in a dark room. Have you ever been in like bright sunlight and then you walk into a really dark room? Right, you can see nothing. You're like, I'm gonna trip on something. You're walking really slowly so you don't bang into something. And you get this intuitive sense. I think there's somebody else in the room, but you can't see them. But if you light a candle and another one and another one and another one, pretty soon you're like, oh, there is someone in the room and I think I can recognize them. So we're gonna light 4 candles to try to light the dark room of doubt, to see the reasonableness of God's existence. Now let me take you back to the 1st century. The Apostle Paul went to the great city of Athens. If you didn't know, Athens in those days was the intellectual capital of the world. Think Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, kind of all combined together. And he went to a place called the Agora, which was a meeting place, a marketplace where people came and shared ideas and talked. And he noticed an altar there to an unknown God. And he said, this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. I want to talk to you about this unknown God. If you can read the whole story in Acts chapter 17, it's a book in the Bible. You can read Paul's speech. What I'm going to do is pull out some themes from his speech. He used the word unknown. It's agnostos in Greek. You probably can hear the connections to English, agnostic, agnosticism. And maybe for you, you have a bit of that agnostic sense of, I think there's a God. I hope there's a God. I'm not really sure. I don't know how sure I can be about that. So we're going to sort of tease out 4 lines of evidence, 4 candles. We're going to light 4 candles to help us see into the dark room of our doubt about God's existence. The first candle we're going to light is the candle of logic, or more specifically, is logic and existence. The candle of logic and existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? Where'd it come from? This argument has been called historically the cosmological argument. It talks about the idea of causality and a first cause. I'm going to get a little philosophical here for those of you who are more concrete. Might take a minute to stay with us here. But let's be concrete for a minute. Pinch yourself really hard. You feel something, right? Bite into an apple. You taste the sweetness. Something exists. We realize it. Something exists. Okay, why is there anything rather than nothing? If there was nothing, it would need no explanation. We wouldn't even be here to talk about it. But something exists. And it had to come from somewhere. Right? There's a beginning, a starting point. There's some cause of what exists. Sound of Music says, nothing came from nothing, nothing ever could. Which raises the issue of an uncaused cause. Now you may be going to what in the world, right? Okay, I know it's little dense there, a little philosophical. An uncaused cause. Something had to be the original cause. A lot of people love to ask a question they believe is the unanswerable question. Okay, so where'd God come from? Got it. You can also ask that about the universe. Where did the universe come from? And most scientists believe the universe had a beginning. That at some point, maybe billions and billions of years ago, however you determine the exact amount of time, matter, energy, mass, time all came into existence. A lot of people call it the Big Bang. That raises this sort of metaphorical question, who pulled the trigger to light off the Big Bang? Where'd this all come from? Okay, picture a circle. You draw a big circle in your mind, that's the universe. So the cause of everything is either from inside the circle or outside the circle. Either inside the universe or outside the universe. But everything in the universe is dependent on something else. So logically, the original cause has to come from outside the universe. Long before the Apostle Paul showed up on the scene of history, Plato and Aristotle reached this same conclusion out of just straight philosophy. Plato said there has to be an original cause, the one. Aristotle in the metaphysics said there has to be an unmoved mover. Paul calls it the maker of heaven and earth. So think about that, the whole argument from logic and existence, as we light our second candle. And the second candle brings the light of science, the light of science. Looking at everything that exists out there, all of nature. Where do you go where you sense, hey, there's got to be something bigger out there? Let me make it simple. Are you a beach person or a mountain person? Where are you on the beach, mountain? For me, my happy place, those of you who know me, it's up high in the Rocky Mountains, right? The staggering cliffs, the sound of the wind whispering in the aspen trees, the roar of a mountain stream. I just know, man, there is something bigger than me. I just kind of connect with God in that sort of space. A number of scholars and scientists in multiple disciplines have said time plus chance does not create complex design. In fact, it usually creates a mess. If you got a part of your yard that you haven't done anything with in a long time, it doesn't look too good, right? It's getting worse year by year. In studying this more specifically, I'll tell you the argument historically has been called the teleological argument. It's really the argument from design. You look at the world, look at all the complexity, all the unique design of the world and say there's got to be a designer. It's kind of the essence of the argument. But this idea that time plus chance can't get us there was stated really powerfully in a book called Evolution from Space. Evolution from Space. The authors are not Christians, but they began to calculate what are the odds that a live enzyme could create a living cell. As they did the math and researched it all, they said our conclusion is that the chances of a live enzyme to a living cell is 10 to the 40,000th power. That's a number way beyond my mind. Let me give you a correlation. Some people estimate the number of atoms in the universe is 10 to the 80th power, just for comparison. So the authors used an illustration. They said the likelihood of a live enzyme to a living cell out of pure chance is the likelihood of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747. Just as an illustration, right? But I think they're right. Looking at the complexity of the world, it's just absolutely amazing to see that this has got to come from somewhere. There's this all that's doesn't make sense that the order came from absolute chaos. However, you might say, wait a minute. You know, I've seen some pretty amazing things that come from just natural processes. How about the Grand Canyon? Stunning example. I've been there to see it one time. It was breathtaking. It was created by erosion. Natural processes explain where the Grand Canyon came from. However, let's say you go to Egypt and see the pyramids. You don't say, look at what erosion did. You're like, some intelligent people created this, and how in the world did they make this thousands of years ago before we had all the tools we have today? Our world is more like the pyramids than the Grand Canyon. It's more intentional order than it is repetitive patterns. And there are a lot of repetitive, beautiful patterns like the Grand Canyon. William Paley, several hundred years ago, used a famous analogy called the watchmaker. Real simple. You're walking on a beach. Okay, now we're talking to the beach people. Gonna give you a little time too. So you're walking on the beach and you see a seashell. It's gorgeous. You pick it up and think, this is amazing. I think I'm gonna take this home. And then you walk along and you stumble on a watch and you pick it up and you think, I wonder who lost their watch. You don't confuse the seashell for the watch. You intuitively understand the difference. You know the difference between a seashell and an Apple iWatch. Our world is more like an Apple iWatch. It shows complex design. For instance, you see that in DNA. DNA is composed of 3 billion base pairs. It's incredibly complex. It's not just repeated patterns. There's a gentleman I'll quote. He was a British philosopher, world-renowned, Oxford professor at Oxford, hardcore atheist since he was 15, till late in his life. Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew would often quote the Socratic quote from Socrates, I must follow the argument wherever it leads. In other words, he really wanted to be intellectually honest. I'm going to follow the argument wherever it leads, whether that means I change my mind or not. Late in his life, he wrote a book, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. I'm not saying he became a Christian, he became a theist. And it was the DNA that convinced him. The more that we understood about DNA, the complexity of it, the significance of it, here's his conclusion. A superintelligence is the only good explanation of the origin of life and the complexity of nature. I think he's right. You see the complexity of DNA, and he's right. For me, that's matched with the exquisitely fine-tuned design of the earth to enable us to live. A number of constants have to be in place. Numbers have to be exactly right, just incredibly fine-tuned. There's actually dozens and dozens of these to enable human life. Let me just give you a simple one. If the earth were marginally closer to the sun, none of us would survive. If it's 200 or 300 degrees, we're not making it. If the earth were a bit farther away from the sun, it'd be too cold for human life. Now, there are dozens and dozens of those that are even much more precise than that. Scientists call it the anthropic principle. Anthropology, okay, human. The anthropic principle is that the universe is fine-tuned for human life at a very sophisticated level. With all that complexity and all that design, both of our world and of human life, it makes sense there was a designer. I agree with astronomer Alan Sandage, who said, quote, I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something instead of nothing. Okay, think about science for a minute as we move to the third candle, which is morality. I'm trying to show some light. Hopefully this gives a little light into our dark room of doubt out of morality. You know the golden rule? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Versions of the golden rule exist in most major philosophies and religions. It's pretty much universal. And it's astounding how universal morality is. Now, let me give a couple caveats here before we go deeper. Christians do not have a monopoly on morality. Many atheists are incredibly moral. They support justice. They stand up against racism. They're for fairness. And that's the case for a lot of people. Jewish people, Muslims, Hindus, agnostics, people around the world. There are quite a few people who really do stand for what's right and good and stand against what's evil and wrong. Second objection, well, we don't have the same moral code. Okay, true on a superficial level. There are differences in moral laws, moral codes around the world. There's differences about alcohol, marijuana, women's rights. Traffic laws are not the same all over the world. But no one supports genocide. We're not confused about that. Everyone understands there's a moral difference between Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler. There's a deep moral code that runs across civilizations and cultures worldwide and through history. Take the human experience of guilt and shame. That's universal. That starts when we're really little. I don't know what age, you start first feeling that. You see that in your kids, they know they've done wrong. And we ask forgiveness. When we're in our best selves, right, we ask forgiveness and we make amends. How about on a more global scale? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to address apartheid and genocide in South Africa. Now been replicated in some other countries like Canada. On a more personal level, recovery organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, including one of their steps, making amends. It's obvious morality exists. It's pervasive. Where did it come from? It didn't just appear out of thin air and somehow get inserted into the hearts and minds of billions of people across so many diverse civilizations all over the world. It seems to imply a morals maker. And by the way, sort of survival of the fittest, like the survival instinct does not explain altruistic morality outside the family group. So where did it all come? Where did morality come? It seems like it would imply a morals maker. So think about that candle. And we're going to light one more candle. The fourth candle is the candle of experience. I want to bring the light of millions of personal testimonies into our dark room of doubt. across history, across the globe, and nearly every civilization and culture I'm aware of, people have expressed some belief in the supernatural. But beyond that, they've said, I feel strengthened by some higher power, maybe to deal with my alcoholism. I feel comforted in my grief. I have felt forgiven. I have had an experience with a real God. Now, you may object, and rightfully so. Both strange and deceptive people can concoct stories of religious experience. True, in fact, they have. There are people who've made up cults and told all sorts of crazy tales of what they've done or experienced, who may not be in their right mind, or they are in the right mind and they're just being manipulative. But we're not talking about one or two people. We're talking about millions, billions of people, literally, all over the world, some of the finest and best minds in history across all walks of life. We're talking about software programmers and engineers and doctors and bankers and housewives, and we're talking about fathers and mothers and children, all claiming this. Some experience with a real God. Well, you could object. Well, could it be that they're all hallucinating? Okay, that they're all lying, that they're all self-deceived? Could there be a worldwide trans-historical conspiracy? Perhaps, but it seems like quite a stretch to go there. And if even one person's experience with God is real, true, it becomes quite likely that we should consider the existence of God. When you're looking at this evidence, of course you can claim, anyone can say something. Saying something doesn't make it true. Exactly. And if it's just one or two people, you can kind of dismiss that. And in fact, there's so much diversity in the human experience. If you've traveled the world or you've met neighbors from all kinds of different cultures and backgrounds. So when you find a common thread woven through the tapestry of humanity, that carries some weight. The testimony of billions of people across the incredible diversity of humanity lights a pretty bright light in this room of doubt. For me personally, the longer I live, the more I've had experiences with God. I just add my voice to the chorus singing this song of God's existence. I've experienced God giving me strength. I've experienced his comfort in grief in some of the hardest times of my life, when there's been a time where it just seemed like the crises all came at once, both work and in graduate school and family, and I cried out to God. And I felt a peace descend on me that I can't explain any other way. No circumstances changed. For me and millions of people, these 4 candles provide enough light to see into the dark room that there is a God. It's reasonable to believe. But let's go back to ancient Athens and St. Paul. When he finished the speech, essentially along these same lines, what were the responses? There were about 3. Some people sneered, probably not surprising. Some said, we'd like to hear more about this. I'd like to hear you more on this matter. And third, some believed. I'm guessing that you could find your response somewhere in that range. You may believe. You may say, I'd like to know more about this. You've kind of stirred up my mind. I'd like to explore this some more. Or maybe you're like, nah, God doesn't exist. That's ridiculous. Whatever the case, because we interpret evidence, obviously, like people in Athens did, all kind of different ways. Nobody should be forced to believe or disbelieve anything. It's when you discover something for yourself. I want to encourage you, ask your questions, explore your doubts. When you examine the evidence yourself and you think it through, then you forge beliefs that are really yours. Not when someone just tells it to you. Think it through yourself. Ask the questions, explore your doubts. That's healthy. What's more reasonable to believe? That God exists or that he doesn't exist? Or that you could be permanently indecisive about it? It's not absolute certainty. It's what's more reasonable. Now, these 4 candles do not demonstrate the validity of Christianity. nor any other specific religion. It's simply to shine the light that God's existence is reasonable. You don't have to abandon intellectual integrity. You don't have to leave your mind at the door based on carefully considered evidence from logic and science and morality and experience. It is reasonable to believe that a God exists. Now, there is a major counter argument we've not considered yet. For all my wonderful experiences with God in the Rocky Mountains, what about people who have been killed from a natural disaster or violence in the mountains? Why is there so much death and sickness and sadness in the world? If God's so good and all powerful, well, then why is there rape and genocide and war crimes? Why are we uncovering mass graves in Ukraine? If there's a God who's supposed to be all good and all powerful, then why is there so much pain and suffering? That's our question for next week. Why is there pain and suffering in the world? Text in your questions. Keep asking your questions. Let me pray for us. God, thank you that you've given us evidences of your existence. And Lord, for each one of us, for me, for each one of us, we pray that you would open our minds, our eyes, our persons to know you more than we do today. In Jesus' name, amen.